I drove 7 hours through a January snowstorm to surprise my husband at his ice fishing weekend in Muskoka, thermos of his favourite dark roast in one hand, the keys to the rented cabin in the other, and heard him say through the thin plywood door, "If she's gone, the life insurance covers everything and I walk away clean." His friend laughed. "Plus, you finally stopped pretending to care." I set the thermos down in the snow. By morning, I was on a flight to Halifax. 3 weeks later, his mother called me crying from a Tim Hortons parking lot. The drive up had been my idea, my small rebellion against a marriage that had started to feel like a performance I hadn't auditioned for. My husband, I'll call him that still, because that's what he was, legally, until he wasn't, had been planning the Muskoka trip for 2 months. 4 guys, a rented ice hut, cases of Molson, the kind of weekend that apparently required 0 contact with wives. "You know how it is, babe," he'd said the Thursday before he left, kissing my forehead in that distracted way that had become his signature. "It's just the guys. You'd be bored." I'd smiled, nodded, and driven him to the GO station. Then I'd gone home to our house in Burlington, sat in the kitchen we'd renovated together the summer before last, and felt the particular silence of a life that no longer fit. We'd been married 4 years. I was 37. I'd spent most of those 4 years quietly making myself smaller so he'd have room to be larger. I'd turned down a senior position at the environmental consultancy where I'd worked for a decade, a role that would have meant travel, late nights, a salary that would have dwarfed his, because he'd said, so casually, "I just think it'll put too much strain on us, you know." I'd believed him. I believed that protecting the marriage was more important than the work I'd actually loved. My mother had noticed before I did. "He reminds me of someone who's always shopping," she'd said once carefully, "even when he already has what he wants." I'd chalked it up to her general wariness of men she hadn't chosen herself. My younger brother had been less diplomatic. He asked me last Christmas how much your inheritance from Gran was. Twice, like he forgot he'd already asked. I told him he was being uncharitable. Standing in the parking lot of a gas station somewhere past Barrie, watching ice crystals form on the windshield while I filled the tank, I'd felt something close to giddy. The thermos was in a bag on the back seat. I'd made the coffee myself, dark roast with a splash of oat milk, the way he taught me in the first year when everything about him seemed worth learning. The keys to the cabin, booked through a rental site, sent to my email because he'd used our shared account, were in my coat pocket. I'd found the booking 2 weeks earlier, when I'd logged in to pay a utility bill. He hadn't tried to hide it. That should have told me something. The road into the rental property was unpaved and the rental itself was set back from a small frozen lake, surrounded by birch trees that looked silver in the headlights. There were 2 trucks parked out front, both of which I recognized. Inside, I could see the orange glow of a wood stove through the window. I could hear music, low, classic rock, and voices underneath it. I was still smiling when I heard his voice through the door, clear, unhurried, like a man discussing a mortgage renewal. "If she's gone, the life insurance covers everything and I walk away clean." I didn't move. My hand was already raised to knock. "What, like an accident?" That was a voice I didn't recognize. "I don't know. I'm just saying the math works out better that way." A pause. "She's got the policy through her work. $250. And there's whatever's left from her grandmother. Plus you finally stopped pretending to care." Laughter. Not uncomfortable laughter. The easy kind. I lowered my hand. I looked down at the thermos in my other hand, wrapped in a cloth bag I'd bought at a farmer's market in Guelph. The one that said something cheerful in block letters. I set it down on the doorstep. Carefully, like it was fragile. I walked back to my car. My legs were working, but I wasn't directing them. I sat in the driver's seat for what felt like a long time and what was probably 90 seconds, The snow was still coming down. A thin skin of it had formed on the windshield already. I started the engine and I drove. I didn't cry until I was back on the highway, and then I only cried for about 4 minutes because something cold and very focused had taken over and it didn't have room for tears. I pulled into a rest stop near Aurelia and sat in the fluorescent light of a vending machine alcove and made 2 calls. The first was to my friend Yolanda, who had known me since university and who did not ask unnecessary questions. "I need somewhere to be that isn't home," I said, "and I need you to not tell anyone I called." "I'll leave the side door unlocked," she said. The second call was to an airline app, not a flight to Halifax, that came later, but a search, fingers moving fast, looking for anywhere that wasn't here. Halifax came up with a seat available on a 6 a.m. departure from Pearson. I booked it before I could argue with myself. One way. My grandmother had grown up in Cape Breton. I'd spent summers there as a child. It was the only place I could think of that felt like it belonged to me and no one else. I drove back to Burlington, moved through our house like a ghost, and packed a single bag. I took my passport, my laptop, the external hard drive with my work files, and a framed photo of my grandmother and me at her kitchen table in Bedeck. I left my engagement ring on the bathroom counter. I looked at it for a moment. A very nice ring, chosen with what I now understood was precision rather than sentiment. And then I went downstairs and left. At Yolanda's, I slept for 3 hours on her couch with a blanket pulled over my head. She didn't ask anything. She put a glass of water on the coffee table and went back to bed. At 4:30, I called a rideshare and went to the airport. The flight to Halifax was nearly empty. I had a window seat and watched Ontario disappear into cloud cover and tried to understand what I actually knew versus what I thought I knew. My husband had, in a conversation I wasn't supposed to hear, discussed the possibility of my death as a financial solution. He had done this without apparent distress. His friend had laughed. Everything I had considered a coincidence assembled itself into something else. The hiking trips where he'd been oddly insistent on routes I wasn't comfortable with. The time I'd nearly gone into the river during a canoe trip, and he'd been on the far bank, watching, not moving, until another paddler reached me first. The suggestion, 8 months ago, that I increase my life insurance policy. For our future, he'd said. In case anything happens, I'd done it. I stared out the airplane window and felt something in my chest go very quiet and very cold. The ferry from North Sydney to Cape Breton was running, barely, in the January swell. I sat inside with a paper cup of tea and watched the spray hit the windows and thought about my grandmother, who had crossed this same water hundreds of times and had always said that the island had a way of sorting people out. "It just asks you who you are," she'd said, "and it waits." My second cousin, Bridget, had inherited my grandmother's house after she died. Bridget was 53, lived alone, grew vegetables, repaired boats, and had an opinion about everything. I hadn't called ahead. When I knocked on the door at 9:30 in the morning, she opened it, looked at me, looked at the single bag over my shoulder, and said, "Come in, the kettle's on." That was the whole conversation for a while. Bridget didn't push. She gave me the back bedroom with the quilt my grandmother had made, and the window that looked out over the Brasdor Lakes. She cooked. She went about her day. When I came to the kitchen table looking hollow, she put food in front of me, and when I needed to talk, she listened without redirecting, and when I needed silence, she provided that too. On the second night, I sat by the wood stove and cried properly. The kind of crying that has no manners, that comes from somewhere below the ribs and doesn't stop until it's done. Bridget sat across from me and didn't say anything until it was over, and then she said, "How long have you known something was wrong?" 2 years, I said, "maybe 3. She nodded like that was a reasonable answer. Over the next few days, small things surfaced. I'd go to wash dishes and remember something, the way he'd reacted when my grandmother died, less condolence than calculation, asking almost immediately about the will. The way he'd slowly repositioned himself between me and my closest friends, small comments, small doubts planted like seeds, until my circle had narrowed to people who were, in some way, his people first. The way he'd responded to my job offer, not concerned about strain on our relationship, I understood now, but concerned about my independence. I borrowed Bridget's laptop and logged into my personal email, the one he didn't know about, the one I'd kept for work correspondence with my former colleagues. 64 new messages, several from friends wondering why I'd gone quiet. 3 from my brother, the most recent one reading only, "Call me when you can, something's off with him." And 2 from an address I didn't recognize, sent to my work account, which I'd given to my husband early in our marriage and had never thought to revoke access to. Both emails were to someone I would learn was a family law paralegal. One contained an outline of my assets. The other asked about the process for having a spouse declared mentally unfit to manage their own finances. I read that one 3 times. He wasn't just thinking about life insurance. He was building a case. I closed the laptop and went outside and stood in the January air for a long time. The lake was frozen and the sky was white, and somewhere across the ice a crow was calling. I thought about who I'd been before I'd met him. The woman who'd once led a team of 12 through a 2-year federal environmental assessment, who'd kayaked alone along the Fundy coastline, who'd been, by every measure, someone who knew her own mind. I thought about who I'd become. Smaller, quieter, carefully managed. The crow called again. I went back inside. I called my brother that afternoon. "I need you to listen without reacting," I said. And he said, "Okay." And I told him everything. He was silent for a long time. Then he said, "That email to the paralegal, that's not just bad. That's potentially criminal. I know, you need a lawyer, not just a divorce lawyer, someone who does family law but understands the fraud angle. I know. Are you safe? I'm in Cape Breton." "He doesn't know I'm here." Another silence. "Good, stay there. I'll start making calls." He had a contact. His firm did occasional work with a family law attorney in Toronto named Adrian Hewin, who had a reputation for precisely this kind of case, financial predation within marriage. I emailed her that evening with a brief, careful summary. She responded within the hour, short, professional, asked for a secure call the following morning. I slept better that night than I had in 3 years. That phone call with Adrian lasted 2 hours. She listened without interruption, asked precise questions, and at the end said, "You have more than you think." The email to the paralegal alone is significant. Combined with the insurance policy documentation and evidence of concealed assets, this is a strong position. She paused. "But I want you to understand that going after someone like this requires patience. He'll have a counter-narrative. He'll claim you're unstable, erratic, that you disappeared without warning. These are standard tactics." "I know," I said. "He's probably already started. Has he filed the missing persons report?" I didn't know. I called my brother. He checked. Yes, filed 48 hours after I'd left. The report described me as emotionally fragile and having a history of anxiety-related episodes, neither of which was true. My husband had apparently told the responding officer that I had been struggling and that he was very worried. The groundwork. I sent Adrian everything I had, the emails, screenshots, what I could reconstruct from memory, and then I called my workplace's benefits administrator from a borrowed phone and asked what the process was for reviewing and updating the beneficiary on my life insurance policy. She walked me through it. I made the change that afternoon. Then I called my bank's fraud department and explained that I believed I was at risk of unauthorized access to my accounts by a spouse with existing access. They flagged the account, required secondary verification for any transactions over $1,000, and suggested I open a new sole account, which I did. Each thing I did felt like closing a door he'd left open. Bridget watched all of this from a thoughtful distance. One evening, she brought tea out to where I was sitting on the cold porch and said, "You're not going to fall apart?" "I might," I said. "No," she said, with the certainty of someone who repaired boats for a living. "You're not the falling apart kind. You're the kind that gets quiet first, then thorough." She was right. Something had shifted in those first days. The shock of what I'd heard had burned away, and what was underneath it was not grief exactly, but clarity. I understood now the shape of what I'd been living inside. I understood that the version of myself that had given up her job and her friends and her independence had done so because she'd been, methodically and patiently, made to. That was not a love story. That was something else. On my 8th day in Cape Breton, a number I didn't recognize called the phone I'd been using. I almost didn't answer. When I did, it was his mother. She was calling from a payphone, a Tim Hortons. I could hear the background noise, and she was crying. "I don't know what's happening," she said. "He told the police you've had breakdowns before. He's saying terrible things about you to your friends. And there are men, I don't know who they are, who came to his work asking about money he owes. He's not telling me anything. I'm scared for him." I felt the pull of it immediately. She was not a bad woman. She had been kind to me in the uncomplicated way of someone who genuinely wanted her son to be happy and had believed for 4 years that I made him so. "How much does he owe?" I asked. A long pause. $80,000. Maybe more. Something to do with sports betting. I only found out last week. He asked to borrow against my condo 2 months ago, and I said no, and he got very cold after that. 80,000. The life insurance policy was 250,000. The math did work out better. "Where is he now?" I asked. "At home, I think. He's been drinking. He doesn't know I'm calling you." I thought for a long moment. "I'm not going to tell you where I am," I said, "but I want you to know I'm safe, and I want you to know I'm safe, and I want to ask you something. Has he ever said anything to you about my mental health, about me being unstable or confused?" The pause told me everything. "He said you sometimes had trouble with reality," she said quietly. "That you made things up when you were stressed." I didn't quite believe him, but I didn't know what to think. "He's been building that narrative for a while," I said. "It's what they do when they're planning something, and they need people not to believe the person they're planning it against." A very long silence. "I'll call you back," I said. "On this number. Give me 2 days." I called Adrian. I called my brother. I called Yolanda, who had a contact at a Toronto investigative firm and who, bless her, had already been quietly documenting some things on her end because, as she put it, I had a feeling you might need it eventually. The investigator's name was Gordon Saw, and he was calm and thorough and asked exactly the right questions. Within 4 days he had documentation of a pattern I hadn't known the full shape of. The sports betting had started 2 years after we married. The debt had been building for 18 months. The secret credit card was real, and the charges on it included, among other things, several hotel stays I had never been part of. There was a line of credit opened in my name that I had never opened. There was a registered beneficiary change submitted on one of my investment accounts. The change had been blocked by the institution, but the attempt was documented. This wasn't a man who had thought about my death once, late at night, when the debts were pressing in. This was a man who had been working toward it. I sat in Bridget's kitchen with that knowledge and felt something that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite anger. It was more like finally seeing the walls of a room you'd been in for years. Men like this count on the person they've hurt being too shocked or too ashamed to fight back clearly, Bridget said, when I told her. "I know," I said. "So don't be." I wasn't. The return to Burlington required precision. I came back in early February on a Tuesday, drove a rental from Hamilton, and checked into a motel in Oakville under my maiden name. I met with Adrian in person for the first time. She was 50, matter-of-fact, and had the particular energy of someone who had seen every version of this situation and had stopped being surprised by any of it without losing her ability to be offended on her client's behalf. We went through everything. The divorce papers were ready, the evidence package, the emails, the insurance documentation, the fraudulent line of credit, the recorded pattern of financial abuse had been filed with Adrian's office in 2 copies and the 3rd copy secured off-site. Gordon had given us documentation of the debt, the secret accounts, the hotel stays. "Here's how this goes," Adrian said. "You go to the house. He'll be thrown off. He'll try to charm you or intimidate you or both. You give him one choice, sign, or this all goes to the RCMP fraud unit and the insurance companies tonight." "Will he sign when he sees what we have?" "Yes. My brother drove me. He parked around the corner and stayed in the car. I walked up to the front door of the house I had helped pay for, and I rang the bell. He opened the door. He'd lost weight. He was unshaven. For 1 second. Just one. I felt the ghost of what I'd once felt for him. Then it was gone. "You're alive," he said. And then, recovering, reaching for the familiar tone, "Thank God, I've been out of my mind. Where have you been?" "I heard you," I said. "In Muskoka, through the door." Everything on his face reorganized itself. The warmth left first. "I don't know what you think you heard. 250,000. Life insurance. Walk away clean." I said it the way he'd said it, conversational, unhurried. "Those were your words." He opened his mouth and closed it. Then he tried a different approach, hurt, bewildered. "Babe, we were drunk. It was a dark joke. You took it out of context." I reached into my bag and put a folder on the hallway table. Emails to a family law paralegal about having me declared unfit to manage my finances. A line of credit opened in my name that I didn't open. A beneficiary change attempted on my RSP. I looked at him. "Do you want to keep going, or do you want to look at the divorce papers?" He looked at the folder. He looked at me. Something shifted behind his eyes. The calculation I'd never been able to name before but could name clearly now. "You don't have anything actionable," he said. "You've been gone for weeks. You're the one who disappeared. How does that look?" "It looks like a woman who overheard her husband discussing her murder and made a sensible decision," I said. "The RCMP fraud unit will think it looks like fraud and attempted financial predation. The insurance company will think it looks like motive. Your employer, given that you use company systems for some of those communications, will think it looks like cause for termination." The silence lasted about 30 seconds. He signed. I'd asked Adrian whether I should offer him anything, a timeline, a way out, and she'd said that was my decision to make, not a legal one. What I gave him was this: 60 days to vacate the property. No pursuit of the debt collectors as long as he engaged with the financial settlement. Honestly, and my silence on the criminal elements, as long as he made no further contact with me, my family, or my brother. It was more than he deserved. I knew that. I made the choice because I wanted to leave the room without needing to watch him suffer, and because Adrian had told me privately that the fraud file wasn't going anywhere. If he attempted anything like this again, the documentation existed, ready in multiple places. The RCMP had already been provided an anonymous tip. His mother was waiting in my brother's car. She'd asked to come. I'd said yes because she hadn't known, and because she deserved the truth from me directly. I sat in the back seat with her and told her what I knew, all of it. She listened with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on the window. When I finished, she said, "I'm sorry, I should have listened more carefully." "You believed what you were told," I said. "He was very good at that." We dropped her at the Aldershot GO station. She squeezed my hand before she got out. I watched her walk through the automatic doors and felt something complicated and sad settle in my chest. and then settle past. My brother drove in silence for a while. Then he said, "What do you do now?" I thought about Bridget's porch, and the frozen lake, and the crow calling across the ice. I thought about the federal assessment job I turned down 2 years ago, and whether there was still a version of that path available to me. I thought about the person I'd been in Cape Breton, quiet, thorough, unhurried, and whether I could bring her back to the mainland intact. "I think I go back to work," I said. "The real work. The kind I was doing before. You could call Leanne at the consultancy." "I already did," I said. "Last week. There's a position. Different province, maybe." She said she'd talked to the Edmonton office. He smiled. "Just a little. Gran would have liked this version of you. I think she always knew this version existed," I said. "She just couldn't tell me that while I was so determined not to see it." I stayed at Yolanda's for 3 weeks while the legal process moved forward. I started running again, something I'd let go 4 years ago, because he'd said it made me too tired to be present in the evenings. I called former colleagues I hadn't spoken to in 2 years. I submitted my name for a provincial advisory committee on watershed assessment that I'd been invited onto and declined, once at his suggestion. The house sold faster than expected. The settlement was clean because the alternative was not clean at all, and he knew it. On the day the transfer was final, I drove to the consultancy's Toronto office and signed the paperwork for the Edmonton position. 6 months, potentially renewable. Federal wetlands assessment in northern Alberta. The kind of work I'd been trained for, the kind that required moving through difficult terrain and paying very close attention to what was actually there versus what someone wanted you to see. Yolanda made dinner that night. Just the 2 of us. Good wine, the kind you open when something matters. "Are you scared?" she asked. "A little," I said. "Mostly I just feel like myself." She raised her glass. I raised mine. I thought about a door in Muskoka, a thermos of dark roast coffee left in the snow, and the moment I turned and walked back to my car instead of walking forward into something I couldn't have walked back out of. I thought about what my grandmother used to say, that the island asks you who you are and then waits for you to answer honestly. I think I finally did. The best thing he ever did for me was say it out loud while I was standing close enough to hear. Everything after that was just me deciding to believe what I'd heard and then deciding what to do with the truth once I had it. Some people spend their whole lives explaining away the thing they already know. I did it for 3 years. I don't intend to do it again. I keep thinking about the thermos, the one I set down in the snow, carefully, like it was something that deserved to be handled gently, even when everything around it had just collapsed. I'd driven 7 hours to bring him coffee. That's where I was in that marriage. Spending 7 hours and a January blizzard to do something thoughtful for a man who had been, quietly and methodically, thinking about how my death would solve his problems. There's a version of that night where I knock anyway, where I decide I misheard, or that it was dark humor, or that love means extending the benefit of the doubt past the point of all reason. I'd already been living that version for 3 years. I'd been extending the benefit of the doubt so long I'd forgotten what my own judgment felt like. What I've come to understand is that the thermos was the last honest thing I did inside that marriage, setting it down and walking back to the car. That was the first honest thing I did coming out of it. Not dramatic, not even angry, not yet, just accurate. I heard what I heard, and for once I didn't explain it away. That clarity, the willingness to finally see what was actually in front of me and to trust that I was seeing it correctly, that was what saved me. Not money, not connections, not anything external. Just the decision to believe the evidence of my own perception after years of being slowly trained not to. That's the thing nobody tells you about this kind of relationship. It doesn't announce itself. It works on you in increments. A job offer turned down. A friendship that fades because it became too complicated. A version of yourself that gets quieter every year and tells herself she's just becoming more mature. By the time I stood outside that cabin door, I'd already lost most of the person I'd been before I met him. Recovering her required something harder than leaving. It required being honest about how much of myself I'd handed over voluntarily, one small accommodation at a time, because it was easier than the conversation that would have followed. Bridget said it best, I think. She said I was the kind of person who gets quiet first, then thorough. I didn't understand that as a compliment until I was sitting across from Adrian going through documents I'd spent 2 weeks carefully gathering, and I realized that the same quality that had made me useful to him, the fact that I'm methodical, that I pay attention, that I don't let things go, had become the thing that was going to undo him. What I chose to do with that moment mattered. I could have let the fear win. I could have accepted his explanation at the door. It was a joke, I misunderstood, I was being paranoid, because that version of events would have required less courage than the one I chose. But there is a point where not acting is its own kind of choice, and I had spent 3 years making that choice already. I wasn't willing to make it again. His mother called from a Tim Hortons payphone. She was scared and she was grieving something she didn't yet have the right words for. I told her the truth because she deserved it, not because it served my case, and because the kind of person I want to be doesn't withhold the truth from someone who's been deceived just as thoroughly as I was. That choice cost me nothing and gave her everything she needed to begin understanding what her son actually was. I don't regret it. The consultancy position in Edmonton starts in 3 weeks. I bought good winter boots and a new field kit. Yolanda made dinner and we opened the good wine. My brother texted at midnight just to say he was proud of me, which made me cry, but the uncomplicated kind. I think about what my grandmother said, that the island asks you who you are and waits. I think I'd been avoiding that question for a long time. The answer, it turns out, was the same person I'd always been. She'd just been waiting quietly for me to come back and claim her.